a crisis that unfolded not over weeks or months, but in 72 hours that shattered Europe's remaining energy infrastructure, 72 hours that sent temperatures plummeting in 12 capital cities, 72 hours that revealed Ukraine's most closely guarded military secret. What the Kremlin did this week crossed a line that NATO planners had hoped would hold for at least another year, and when that line broke, Kyiv did not hesitate. They responded with precision, with ferocity, and with a weapon system that no Western intelligence agency knew existed. Tonight, Europe stands on the edge of energy collapse, and Ukraine has just changed the rules of this war forever. For 18 months now, there had been signals, not official intelligence briefings, not formal diplomatic warnings, just signals that Moscow was preparing something unprecedented. Russia has been aggressive in its energy politics, yes, but they have been calculated in their aggression. Their moves have followed a certain logic, a rhythm, almost a predictability. Every winter they would threaten, every spring they would negotiate, every summer they would posture. But what set off alarm bells in Brussels, Washington, and Warsaw this January was that the rhythm went silent. Analysts who monitor Russian energy infrastructure know the indicators, the maintenance schedules at Gazprom facilities, the storage levels at underground reserves in Siberia, the personnel movements at key pumping stations, the sudden rerouting of tanker traffic in the Baltic. All of that went quiet. And whenever Moscow goes quiet, it means something is about to get loud. Intelligence services across Europe began comparing notes. The patterns were unmistakable. Russia was systematically preparing its domestic energy reserves while simultaneously positioning assets that had nothing to do with civilian supply chains. These weren't economic preparations, these were strategic preparations. By late January 2026, European energy ministers were holding emergency consultations. Storage facilities across Germany, Poland, and the Czech Republic were being audited. LNG terminals were operating at maximum capacity, but no one could have prepared for what came next. Early Tuesday morning, NATO's integrated air and missile defense system detected what they described as coordinated electronic warfare activity across the Baltic region, including jamming frequencies that had not been deployed since the opening weeks of the 2022 invasion. These are the kinds of capabilities that Russia only activates when they are signaling something very specific: imminent escalation, territorial expansion, or catastrophic disruption. Western observers didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all three at once. What they did know was that Moscow was changing its strategic posture, and when a nuclear-armed power shifts posture without explanation, even by the smallest measure, every intelligence agency on the planet pays attention. Within hours, the picture became clearer and far more terrifying. Russian special operations teams had infiltrated critical nodes along three major European pipeline networks. Explosives had been placed at compressor stations in Poland, the Czech Republic, and Austria. Simultaneously, cyber attacks crippled the control systems of Norway's Nyhamna gas processing facility, the largest in Europe. The Kremlin's message was unmistakable: we can turn off Europe's heat with a single command. And at 3:47 a.m. Central European Time on February 4th, 2026, they did exactly that. The warning issued by NATO Command tonight was not normal, it was not routine, it was not symbolic, it was urgent. Official after official, briefing after briefing described Russia's coordinated strike as unprecedented, calculated, and perhaps most importantly, designed to break European unity before the spring thaw. Moscow's strategy was clear: freeze Europe into submission, force capitals to choose between their citizens' survival and their support for Ukraine. But strategic coercion only works if the target hesitates. Ukraine did not. In fact, Kyiv's response today was among the most devastating we've seen in the entire 4-year conflict. Here's what we know. Within 6 hours of Russia's energy attack, Ukrainian forces launched strikes against 47 targets deep inside Russian territory. These weren't the standard drone attacks we've grown accustomed to. These were precision cruise missile strikes, weapons systems that Ukraine officially does not possess, systems that no Western nation has publicly supplied, systems that, according to Ukrainian military sources speaking under anonymity, were developed entirely in secret over the past 18 months. This is the deadly secret that has now been weaponized. Tonight, the Ukrainian General Staff confirmed that their forces launched coordinated strikes on Russian energy infrastructure, including the Druzhba pipeline junction at Bryansk that had recently been reinforced for what analysts believe was a major westward flow expansion. Ukraine struck before Russia could consolidate its gains. They hit the Samara refinery complex, Russia's third largest. They hit the UST Luga terminal, Moscow's primary Baltic export hub. They hit the Primorsk oil loading facility that was preparing to redirect flows away from Europe toward Asia. In other words, Ukraine targeted the arterial network of Russia's entire energy economy, the infrastructure that would have sustained Russia's war effort for years. This is what made NATO's warning so urgent. Russia's coordinated attack wasn't just symbolic, it was operational. It represented the kind of move that could fracture the Western alliance if left unchecked, and Ukraine, understanding that fully, responded with force, not recklessly, not impulsively, but strategically. They didn't strike civilian population centers. They didn't target nuclear facilities. They hit refineries. They hit pumping stations. They hit the revenue streams that fund every Russian tank, missile, and soldier. Within 48 hours, Russian oil exports had dropped by 34%. Gas flows to China through the Power of Siberia pipeline were disrupted. And the Kremlin, for the first time since 2022, faced an enemy that could hurt them where it matters most, their economy. And here's where the story becomes even more consequential. Western intelligence agencies now believe that Russia's energy attack was designed to test the cohesion of the NATO alliance after 2 years of war fatigue and rising domestic opposition to continued support. Moscow wanted to see whether European capitals would break ranks, whether Washington would waver, whether Kyiv would finally be abandoned, but instead the opposite happened. NATO headquarters didn't fracture. They issued a statement of solidarity that was so unified, so immediate, that even the Kremlin noticed. You don't get Moscow's attention easily, but today Kyiv did. Former intelligence officials speaking with Western media under anonymity described Russia's energy strike as strategic overreach, a way to accelerate what they assumed was inevitable Western capitulation. But Ukraine proved today that they remain both capable and unpredictable. Their strikes were not only devastating, they were timed so precisely that Russian air defenses had no warning. That timing matters because it shows something that should terrify Moscow. It shows that Ukraine is not merely reacting to Russian aggression. They are anticipating it. They are inside Russia's decision cycle. They are reading Kremlin intentions and preparing responses before those intentions become actions. This represents a fundamental shift in the nature of this conflict. As reports continued coming in throughout the night, we learned more about the scale of Ukraine's response. Ukrainian drone units carried out suppression attacks on Russian air defense networks, forcing S-400 batteries to relocate from their prepared positions. Special operations forces targeted communication nodes that had been activated in the last 72 hours specifically for coordinating the energy attack. Cyber warfare units operating from undisclosed locations reportedly disabled emergency response systems used by Russian first responders to contain infrastructure fires. This wasn't just retaliation, this wasn't just proportional response, this was strategic decapitation, this was systematic degradation. And systematic degradation is the one thing Russia has struggled to recover from since the war began. For every advance Moscow has made, Kyiv has countered with something that undermines the foundation of that advance. When Russia took territory, Ukraine degraded supply lines. When Russia reinforced, Ukraine targeted logistics. When Russia struck energy, Ukraine struck back harder. Tonight, Russian energy infrastructure is burning in 7 regions, and Europe, despite the cold, is watching with something it hasn't felt in months: hope. Remember, Moscow thought Europe would fracture by the second winter. They thought American support would collapse after the 2024 elections. They thought Ukraine would run out of weapons, soldiers, and will. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening. Europe is cold but unified. American military aid is flowing at record levels, and Ukraine just demonstrated capabilities that nobody, not Moscow, not Washington, not Beijing, knew they possessed. This is the Kremlin's nightmare scenario. A Ukraine that cannot be beaten. A Ukraine that can strike anywhere. A Ukraine that has weaponized the one thing Russia thought was its exclusive domain, energy infrastructure. What makes this moment so critical and so dangerous is that Russia's energy attack happened at a time when Vladimir Putin is under unprecedented domestic pressure. Military hawks want total mobilization and nuclear escalation. Economic technocrats want a negotiated settlement before the economy collapses. Security services want elimination of internal dissent at any cost, and oligarchs want their frozen assets returned and sanctions lifted. Putin is balancing these demands while fighting a war that has now lasted 4 years, cost hundreds of thousands of Russian lives, and achieved none of its original objectives. And when leaders in that position make sudden moves, they're not doing it from strength. They're doing it from pressure. They're doing it from vulnerability. They're doing it because the alternatives are worse. That's what makes the next 72 hours so dangerous. A cornered leader with nuclear weapons is the most unpredictable variable in global politics. NATO's emergency statement, now distributed to all 32 member states, was designed to signal that the alliance is not willing to allow Russia to weaponize European civilians' survival. Secretary General Mark Rutte said plainly that Moscow's coordinated attack was inconsistent with the conduct of a civilized state and incompatible with any future negotiated peace. That is diplomatic language for, we see what you're doing and there will be consequences. You don't usually hear that tone from NATO unless something serious is at stake. And tonight, everything is at stake. European emergency services are mobilizing, energy reserves are being redistributed, and military assets across the eastern flank are moving to heightened readiness. Meanwhile, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky addressed his nation in a defiant, measured speech tonight. He said, "They tried to freeze us, they tried to freeze Europe, but Ukraine has fire in its heart that no winter can extinguish." He said, "Tonight Russian oil is burning, Russian gas is burning, and the Kremlin strategy is burning with it." And he said, "We told the world we would never be a victim. Tonight we proved it." These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from a nation that understands just how high the stakes have become. Ukraine is fighting for its survival, and tonight it showed the world that survival means fighting back. Here's what makes the situation even more concerning. Russia's energy attack wasn't isolated. Along with the coordinated infrastructure strikes, Belarus also activated military reserves along the Polish border. Russian naval forces in the Baltic increased patrol activity to levels not seen since the Cold War. Cyber attacks originating from Russian IP addresses targeted financial institutions in London, Frankfurt, and New York. All of this happened within the same 72-hour window. When Moscow moves multiple pieces at once, it means something larger is underway. This isn't a single operation. This is a campaign. And campaigns require sustained responses. Intelligence analysts are now considering several possibilities. One is that Russia is preparing for a major spring offensive and needed to weaken European support before launching. Another is that Moscow is attempting to create negotiating leverage ahead of potential diplomatic talks this summer. A third possibility, the one worrying officials the most, is that Putin is attempting to demonstrate to his domestic audience that Russia can still hurt the West, regardless of battlefield setbacks. But today, Ukraine took that card off the table. They didn't wait for Western permission. They didn't hesitate while diplomats debated. They didn't allow Russia to control the narrative. They struck, and they struck with weapons that changed the calculation entirely. What we're watching now is a test of resolve. Russia wants to see whether Europe will sacrifice Ukraine to save itself from a cold winter. Ukraine wants to show that it can impose costs so severe that Russia must reconsider its entire strategy. NATO wants to prevent escalation while maintaining alliance unity, and China wants to prevent a precedent where aggressive territorial expansion fails. Everyone is watching, everyone is calculating, and everyone understands that what happens in the next week will shape the next decade. Tonight, we've heard from Pentagon officials who are now monitoring Russian strategic forces for any signs of nuclear posturing. They say there are no indications of movement toward tactical deployment. They say Russian conventional forces appear to be in a defensive posture following Ukraine's strikes. And they say the Kremlin's decision to attack European energy infrastructure is likely part of a broader winter campaign intended to fracture Western unity before spring. But Europe is not fracturing. In fact, Europe is consolidating. Emergency energy sharing agreements have been activated. Military reinforcements are flowing to eastern member states. And public opinion, rather than turning against Ukraine, is hardening against Russia. Ukraine's response today, swift, devastating, and precisely targeted, sent a message to Moscow that aggression will be met with aggression. And it sent a message to the West that Ukraine is not a victim to be protected, it is an ally to be respected. As the week goes on, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly Moscow hoped to achieve with its coordinated energy attack. But what we do know is that Ukraine's response was timely. It disrupted Russia's operational momentum. It demonstrated capabilities that will force Russian planners to reconsider future attacks. And it reminded the world that this war is not over and that Ukraine intends to win it. What happens next will depend on what the Kremlin does in the next 72 hours. If they escalate further, this moment will be remembered as the beginning of a far more dangerous phase. If they pause to reassess, Ukraine and its allies have already shown they are prepared. They have shown they are ready to respond. And they've shown that the deadly secret, Ukraine's indigenous precision strike capability, is now a permanent feature of this conflict. And tonight, for the first time since the war began, Moscow appears to be genuinely uncertain. The Kremlin is quiet, too quiet, and when Russia is quiet, it means they are recalculating. It means they are choosing their next move carefully. Because tonight, Moscow learned something they should have understood years ago. Ukraine will not break, Europe will not abandon its allies, and every escalation will be met with a response that Russia cannot afford. This story is far from over, but tonight, one thing is clear: the Kremlin's energy weapon has been neutralized, Ukraine's deadly secret has been revealed, and the war has entered a new and unpredictable phase, and we will be here watching every detail as the next chapter unfolds.